All right, let's talk about trophic levels and food chains. So a trophic level, remember troph means eat or feed. So the trophic level is which level of eating an organism is at. So if it's on the lowest level, then it's a producer. That's everything photosynthetic. And then we have consumers, carnivores, and top carnivores, finally. So there's a bit of a difference between marine food chains and terrestrial food chains, but a lot of similarities as well. One of the big differences is the mass of the primary producers. In a terrestrial ecosystem, the primary producer's total mass is going to be enormous and outweigh the consumers. But in a marine ecosystem, although the primary producers are abundant, because they are being consumed extremely rapidly, their total mass may actually be less than the consumers. A food web is just linked food chains. So, and this is because organisms that are the primary producers may be eaten by many different consumers, and each of the lower level consumers may be eaten by multiple different carnivores. So, and even the top carnivores that aren't eaten by anything else that's shown in the food web, ultimately they're going to decompose and be eaten by the detritivores. So the food chain, interestingly, the food chains tend to not be longer than 4 links from primary producer to top carnivore. And that's because of how much energy is consumed at each level, that the amount of energy remaining for the next level up is much smaller than you would think. So only about 10% of the energy stored in any particular trophic level can be converted into organic matter in the next trophic level. So, for example, if you have 100 kilograms of plant material that's eaten by an herbivore, you'll only get about 10 kilograms of herbivore mass for that 100 kilograms of plant material. And this is an approximation, but it very well explains what we see in ecosystems, and that is that the total mass of the top carnivores tends to be very small, and they tend to be much rarer animals than the primary consumers or the producers in an ecosystem. So another thing that happens in a food chain is that the top carnivores tend to be larger. And that makes sense. If you have an animal that's eating other animals, they tend to be larger. So that's going to also limit the number of those individuals that are present. Some species are what we call dominant in a community. They have a larger impact because they are numerous. Other species have a large impact because even though they're in very small numbers, and those are keystone species, so we'll talk about both of those. So a dominant species is very abundant and even in a stable ecosystem. They're not abundant because they're an invasive species, for example. So before humans showed up, American bison were extremely abundant, and that's because they were the predominant large herbivore of the very large area grasslands that are found in much of what's now the United States and southern Canada. Sometimes invasive species become the dominant species because either they lack predators, they lack parasites maybe that are found in their native habitat, or they just lack competition for resources and they're exploiting a niche that there isn't anything exploiting that niche currently. One way to find out what effects dominant species have is if they are removed. For example, when the American bison were almost hunted to extinction by uh, American hunters, one of the consequences of that was the deterioration of the grasslands, or we call it prairie in the United States, because one of the benefits of large herbivores, because large herbivores evolved with the prairie ecosystem, they take, remember in a grassland you have more limited water. So if you have abundant rainfall, you can have trees. If you have less abundant rainfall, then you get grasslands. So that's what prairie is. Prairie has more limited rainfall, and that's most of the Midwest in the United States and in southern Canada. So when you have a large herbivore there, what they do is drink water. They then urinate all over the grass and water it. They also poop everywhere and fertilize the grass. So bison were very beneficial to the prairie ecosystem. And removing them caused a deterioration in the number of species present and the soil quality because of the lack of both them moving the water around and also fertilizing as they went. Another large dominant species that was removed accidentally was the American chestnut trees. Chestnut trees used to be, there were tens of millions of chestnut trees in North America 150 years ago. They were one of the most popular trees to plant for pioneers, farmers in cities. They were fast growing. They provided food for both humans and animals. People used to feed the chestnuts to livestock as well as eating them themselves. And a blight fungus was accidentally introduced from Asia and wiped out almost 100% of the American chestnut trees. They have found a few pockets of isolated hilltop colonies of American chestnut trees in Vermont and New Hampshire, and they're developing hybrid chestnut trees that are resistant to the blight. So we might have chestnut trees back again. But these trees disappeared within a few decades. They totally disappeared. And studying what happens when those trees disappeared both from the wild landscape and from urban and suburban areas can teach us a lot about what that species actually did. That's a terrible way to study a native species, though. We would never want to do that deliberately. A keystone species is a species that's rare, but when it's removed, it will have a huge and detrimental impact on the ecosystem. Keystone species like this are usually predators of some kind. Predators keep herbivores in control. And one good example of this was there was an experiment done in tidal communities. I think it was off the coast of Oregon or Washington, somewhere up in the Northwest. A marine biologist who was studying the tidal ecosystem experimentally removed different species one at a time from his experimental area. So he had marked off experimental areas within these tidal pools, and he would go in there every day and by hand remove one species from the area and then look at the impact over the course of a year. And what he found was that one of the rarest species had the biggest impact, and that was a particular species of sea star. And what he found was that when he removed the sea star, and the genus name is Pisaster, that's what that is there, it's this what it looks like. When the sea stars were removed, it turns out although there were several predators in the ecosystem, the only one that ate mussels, which are a bivalve that lives cemented to the substrate as an adult. When the predator was removed, when the sea stars were removed, within a few months, the mussels became very abundant. And although the mussels don't eat the other species, they crowded them out. And so in a year, with the removal of the sea star, there will be nothing but mussels. So remember, when you have less species diversity, that we usually consider that as being something bad. So removal of the sea star decimated the species abundance of everything else except mussels. So mussels were the dominant competitor for space when they didn't have a predator that ate them. The other predators that were present eventually disappeared because they couldn't eat the mussels. So the only thing that could eat the mussels was the sea star. So that would be so even though sea stars were rare, it was found that they were in fact one of the most important species in the ecosystem because of their ability to keep mussels in check. Sometimes there are species that are rare that really significantly alter the species. And beavers are one of these species. Beavers are rodents. They're very large rodents. And beavers dam up flowing water. So if they find a creek or even a smallish river, they will build a dam out of sticks and small logs and fill it in until water stops flowing. And they create ponds. And beavers were pretty much removed completely from the lower 48 states because of fur trapping. So beaver pelts were highly desired for making coats, and they were completely extirpated from the lower 48 states. They were also considered to be destructive. So if you had a farm and you had a creek flowing through it and beavers showed up, they would dam up that creek, and you might lose a couple of acres of your farm because now there's a giant pond there where the creek used to be. I in fact know somebody, a farmer downstate, who is currently battling encroaching beavers who keep coming onto his property and damming up creeks and creating ponds where he's trying to grow trees. But what has been found is that in very dry ecosystems in the western United States, places where the annual rainfall is not optimal for trees, and that tend to be kind of dry, if you reintroduce beavers, which there's a huge program right now to reintroduce beavers to private property and public lands all over the western United States, because we're not hunting them anymore, that they completely transform the landscape. That once you have a beaver pond, now you have water for wildlife all year round. You have fish can return, uh, amphibians can return, migratory birds and migratory waterfowl will now have a place to stop, and it really changes the landscape. So beavers are very good for the environment, although a lot of farmers don't like them because you'd lose a few acres. I even heard about one who was fined by his local state Department of Natural Resources because beavers built a dam on his property, and somebody reported it that he had a junk pile on his property, and he had to prove that it was animals doing it, not him. So when there's a disturbance, and a disturbance could be a human-caused disturbance, like a farm, or it could be a natural disturbance like a volcanic eruption. This picture here, this is from not long after the eruption of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. Mount St. Helens erupted. It was kind of a small to medium-sized volcanic eruption in 1980. And this was a dense pine forest, and you can see all the trees are knocked down like matchsticks. We would call that a disturbance. And there's nothing growing back yet. This was an image within the first few months after the volcanic eruption. It looks very different today, but it still has not recovered to what it looked like before the eruption in 1980. So there is a succession of plants and different changes that we expect to see after a disturbance, and that's called succession. For example, Yellowstone National Park in 1988 had a pretty large fire that was allowed to burn. It was quite controversial. Fire is a part of the ecosystem, and when you suppress fire for decades, as had been done, you actually can harm the ecosystem. There are some plants that don't germinate unless there's a fire. And after this provided also an opportunity, though, for scientists to study the succession that occurs in this community when there is a fire. And the forest recovered quite quickly. I visited Yellowstone National Park in 2005, and you could hardly tell that a fire had occurred. We visited the area that had been burned and saw the before pictures of what it looked like in 1988, and you could barely tell that anything had occurred. So only 1 year after the fire, there was already significant recovery of plants. There are seeds in the soil that can survive, and many plants, in fact, that will do very well when the dominant trees have been burned and removed. The ash from the trees provides fertilizer. It gets rid of invasive species. So it's not entirely a negative thing when we have a fire in a natural area. Depends on the area. So what we call this change that happens after a disturbance is called ecological succession. Primary succession only occurs if there's no soil. So primary succession would occur, for example, if there's a volcanic eruption and there's cooled lava or volcanic ash, no soil at all. It's just rock. That's primary succession. This would also occur if a glacier recedes, which we have lots of those happening now. Where the glacier used to be will just be a bare gravel bed with no soil. So primary succession is what's going to occur there. So scientists have studied what species can colonize that soilless environment, and there are few. There are very few plants that can colonize that rocky, gravelly, soilless environment. And a few other kinds of organisms like lichens can colonize bare rock. They're one of the few. And there's a few plant species that can tolerate that kind of environment. They help create soil. We're going to talk more about soil when we get to plants, but soil is made up of both tiny rock pieces and decaying plant matter. Both are necessary for soil. So if you just have rocks, if it's fine, then it's sand or silt, and if it's larger, it's gravel, or even like just a solid piece of cooled lava. That's not soil. You have to have plant material mixed in there, decaying plant material, for it to be soil. So that takes a while. So there are some pioneering plants that get that process started, and then other plants which require soil can then survive. So there's one particular receding glacier that has been extensively studied in Alaska, and let's talk a little bit about that. Glacier Bay, Alaska is the result of a receding glacier. Glacier Bay didn't exist 200 years ago. It was a glacier, and as it has receded, scientists have studied the succession of the plant community, which we can even see all at once because there's areas that were exposed 50 or 100 years ago, and then there's other areas that have only been exposed more recently. So the first pioneering plants that can colonize this bare gravel include some mosses, willows. Dryas is a species of wildflower. This is a picture of a dryas. It's a kind of an iconic alpine plant. Liverworts, we'll talk about those when we get to the plant section. So here's Glacier Bay, and the glacier extended in the 18th century all the way to the edge here, so there was no Glacier Bay in the 18th century. So, and Glacier Bay has and the glacier has receded and continues to recede today. So the first stage, what we see in the more newly exposed gravel bed, where the glacier has most recently receded from, we see scattered plants, 0 trees, no large woody plants. Very particular plants can colonize this area. The second stage is called the Dryas stage, again because we find this alpine flower is one of the plants that can colonize during the second stage. So in the Dryas stage, we have a thin layer of soil, but it's not very fertile. There's not a lot of nitrogen yet. Once these plants grow for many, many years and establish a thicker layer of soil, now alder trees can become established. Alder trees don't need a thick layer of fertile soil. They can grow in relatively thin, poor soil, which is why they're among the first trees to appear. And then the last stage is called the spruce stage. Spruce trees require a thicker layer of soil, more nitrogen, and so when you finally see spruce trees growing, you know that it's reached its end, that this succession has reached its pinnacle stage. So why? What is it about the alder trees that makes way for the spruce trees? Well, alder trees have root nodules. This is a root here. They have root nodules that contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and we'll talk more about that again in the plants section when we get to that next. That's our in modules 1 and 2. We will talk, or not 1 and 2, 2 and 3. We'll talk more about that. So when alder trees are growing, they bring along a home for nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and that increases the nitrogen level in the soil, which other plants need. So they make nitrogen for themselves, but they also increase the fertility of the soil. And by this point, by the time you have alder trees growing, this succession has been going on for many decades, and a thicker layer of soil is building up, and then finally spruce trees can take root. Now, if you tried to plant spruce seeds in the soil during an earlier stage, they might initially germinate, but they wouldn't be able to grow because there just wouldn't be enough nutrients. And for most soil, as we'll find out, it's nitrogen that's the limiting factor in plant growth. There are other elements that are also important for plant growth, like calcium, magnesium, but for most soils, nitrogen is the limiting factor. So that's what we see here with the succession. With early on, there's almost no nitrogen. Alders greatly increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil. The thickness of the soil is also increasing because of the annual leaf falls from the trees and from the other plants dying. Because remember, soil is decaying plant matter and crushed rock. And then finally, you have some healthy soil and you can get spruce trees growing. Secondary succession doesn't start with no soil. So primary succession, you have to have rock. There's no soil. Secondary succession means there's a significant disturbance, but you didn't lose the soil. So the eruption of Mount St. Helens and the recovery of the forest there is secondary succession. The recovery after the fire in Yellowstone National Park, that's secondary succession, because we didn't lose the soil. The soil is still there, but there was a significant disturbance. So clearing land for farming is also a disturbance. So if a farm is abandoned and it returns to its natural state, whether that's a prairie or a woodland, that's secondary succession. And it will follow a similar sequence of events, that the plants that grow first are different from the final plants that you will see. We humans are quite good at disturbing things. We disturb things not just with our farming, but every place we go. We disturb the ecosystems. We disturb the ecosystems just, creating lawns and housing and everything that we do. We also disturb marine ecosystems significantly, and not just with fishing, which we certainly do a lot of fishing and we have damaged ecosystems with that, but the way we fish also can have a different effect on the ecosystem. You may have heard that environmentalists are suggesting that if you're going to buy tuna, that you buy line-caught tuna instead of tuna that was caught with trawling nets. And that's because trawling drags nets along the bottom and destroys much more of the ecosystem than line fishing does. So if you look on a can of tuna, it often will say pole caught or line caught, and that means that they just dropped individual lines and caught the fish. They didn't do it by dragging a net across the bottom of the ocean, which is much more damaging. And the line caught and pole caught tuna also, they don't have as much bycatch or accidental catch. So bycatch is all the other species that just get thrown back and often die before they get thrown back. So this is just a summary of some of the interactions that we talked about. Competition between species, which is negative for both species. If two species share exactly the same niche, one will be eliminated from that environment. So they have resource partitioning so that species have resource partitioning so that they don't occupy exactly the same niche, like one species becoming a daytime active species, for example. Predation or beavery, parasitism, this is where one species benefits and the other species is negatively impacted by that. Positive interactions, so mutualism means both species benefit, and commensalism means one species benefits and the other species is neutral, like squirrels in a tree. The tree does not benefit or is harmed by the squirrels, but the squirrels benefit immensely from living in the tree.